Good morning, and you're all very welcome to the Better Europe Alliance conference this morning. We're looking at creating a socially and economically and environmentally sustainable Ireland in Europe. My name is Joan O'Donnell, and I work with the Disability Federation of Ireland. We are one of the members of the Better European Alliance, which in total at the moment has 12 members from civil society organisations. And you can see a lot of our banners around the room, but I don't think they're all there, so I'm just going to name out who's on the Alliance. Okay, we have Age and Opportunity, the Disability Federation of Ireland, as I mentioned already, the Environmental Pillar, the European Anti-Poverty Network, the Irish National Organisation of the Unemployed, Irish Rural Link, the National Adult Literacy Agency, the National Association of Building Cooperatives, the National Women's Council, SIP2, Social Justice Ireland, and the Society of St Vincent de Paul. And it's highly significant as well that we're actually working with the environmental pillar in this alliance. So that marks a very, very significant move towards working together towards a more sustainable Europe. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to is this fantastic publication, which can be your Bible for the introduction to the European semester, because I'm very aware that some people in the room are old hands at this kind of information and the structures and processes that are involved, and for others, it's all very, very new. So it's very important to us that we are in the business as the Better Europe Alliance of creating better engagement and dialogue, not just on the processes, but also on achieving the targets set out in Europe 2020 and ensuring a more equitable and sustainable Europe. So your questions are very welcome here this morning. Any questions for clarification are very welcome. Any comments are very, very welcome. And it's really, really important that if you're not following something that you do ask. So it's our hope this morning that everybody goes away with some better knowledge and more of a curiosity about how this is influencing Irish policy and how we can influence this. Okay, so I'm going to move very quickly to our first speaker. And I'd like to introduce Michael Ewing from the Environmental Pillar, who has got the very onerous task of, in a very short space of time, actually making us all understand completely and utterly what the European semester and Europe 2020 is all about. Okay, I'll hand over to you, Michael.
Thank you for that introduction and for the onerous task bit. It's absolutely right. There are people in the room, obviously, who do have a very clear handle on what this is all about. And then there's the rest of us, including me, who have some kind of an understanding but need to know more. So what I'm hoping to do here is to just give you a very brief introduction. There will be some names and things in here which you're probably not familiar with if you're not in this process already. The presentation will be available later, so you don't need to absorb all this stuff or write it all down necessarily. Just try and get the drift of what's going on in here, because it's really, this process is critical to the development of this country. It's absolutely critical that we do engage with it. It's critical that we understand it, and it has serious implications for us and for all the other people in Europe as well. So that's the first thing I just want to say about it. So this is it, basically, in a nutshell, I suppose. The states of the European Union have agreed to work together as a union, and because of what happened in the crash and because of what's coming down the line in terms of potential impacts of climate change, etc., they decided to work together and produce a strategy for the 10 years between 2010 and 2020. And within that, there's a number of high-level intentions, shall we say, things they want to achieve. And at the same time, they wanted to create a Europe that was financially and economically stable. So there are two strands to this, you might say. There's the high-level vision of things that we want to do with our society and protections for the environment and so on. And then there's the economic strand, which is on your right, I think, as you're looking at the screen. And together, the process that delivers on these is called the semester process, or the European semester. And it's an annual cycle for measuring review and correction, if you like, of what's going on in each country and across the Union. So that's in a nutshell what it's about. So I'm just going to run very quickly through a number of other slides just to give you a little more detail, not too much hopefully, on the different strands of this. So first of all, what is Europe 2020? Well, it's a vision. It's an aspirational document, we might say. It has no force in law in one sense. It is an agreed document. It's a club of people coming together and saying we want to do this, we want to achieve this over this period of time, and replace the Lisbon strategy, which was there before. It's a vision for the decade, and it has 5 headline targets, which you'll see over the next couple of slides. So the first one is about jobs. It's what we all hear about all the time. We must create more jobs because a lot of unemployment, and that's very obvious in a sense. And we have a target across Europe, and we have an Irish target. Similarly, in terms of the economy, in terms of development, and innovation, Europe is intending to invest 3% of Europe's GDP into research and development. And Ireland has its own target, which is somewhat lower. It's about 2% in terms of GDP. So that in itself is interesting. In terms of poverty, which is a huge issue across Europe, there was a target to get at least 20 million fewer people in or at risk of poverty and social exclusion. As you'll find out later on, we may not have got there, and Ireland again has its own targets. In terms of climate change, which is these are the other two high-level targets, greenhouse gas emissions reduced, energy from renewables, and increase of energy efficiency. Ireland has its own targets again inside this. All the targets are agreed between the countries and the European Union. It's not something that's been imposed. This is something that's been agreed in advance, so people have to work on these things and deliver them. It's a solidarity within countries across the European Union to deliver on all these different aspects. And the final high-level point was the reducing the rates of early school leaving below 10%, and at least 4% of the 30 to 34-year-old completing third level education. Basically, Ireland's targets, again, are different to the European ones because they're specific to Ireland. And underneath then, this are a series of flagship initiatives, which I'm not going to go into, which are more detailed about delivering on these various high-level targets. So the other strand, the economic strand. So what is the Stability and Growth Pact? Well, effectively, it's a way of looking at how governments control their own finances and how the big picture economy is working and making corrections on an annual basis. That's what it's about. And so there's various targets set into there. And the other aspect of it is that those countries in the Eurozone have to submit their budgets for approval by the European Commission on an annual basis. This is something that's happened, which some countries take great exception to. The issue of the government deficit to GDP ratio is another issue which is up for debate right now because we have two countries. Anyway, I won't go into the details, I'm just trying to introduce it to you, because that'll all come later. And then the other one is the macroeconomic imbalances procedure. Basically, this is a score sheet where all the different indicators are looked at and we see how we're doing. It's complicated, I'm not going to go into it, but it includes measures which say what the particular countries have to do for the next year if they're not doing well in this particular area. And these come up as country-specific recommendations. So, what is the European semester? We know what the two strands are. What is the semester? Well, it's basically, as I said before, an annual cycle of measurement, review and correction. And to do that, there's a number of mechanisms within that, and one's called the Annual Growth Survey. This is a look at all the economic factors within the Union on an annual basis, which is agreed between the Commission and the Member States as what needs to be done for the next year. This is what's happening. What do we need to do about it to make sure we're still back on track? So the Annual Growth Survey does that. The Alert Mechanism Report is another yearly document which comes out at the same time and looks at the bigger picture economic imbalances. So forget all the names, just remember the idea, okay? Because unless you're into this, it'll take a while to soak in. And then annually, then the member states have reform programs to deliver on the various targets at a national level, and they produce a report annually, and how they will reach them every year in April. And they build on the large picture ideas from Europe, and as somebody addressed, and later on the European Commission uses the annual report, the national reform programs then to decide on what the country-specific recommendations are. But there's no sanctions attached to this. This is about Europe 2020, which is about high-level ideas. Thank you. About high-level ideas. So there's no sanctions from Europe if we don't deliver on them. There's just political order, if you like. You know, you're not the best boy in the club or the best girl in the club if you don't deliver. And then there's the economic side. And this side, there are sanctions. If we don't deliver on the economic side, there are sanctions. We can have funding withdrawn by Europe. But again, there's a question right now because whether that actually will ever happen again in reality, because of some of the larger states are coming up against this big time. So the country-specific recommendations then, once the member states submit their national reform programs and their stability or convergence reports, which are about the economic side, The European Commission reviews them and then issues country-specific recommendations for each member state. So these are things we have to do in the next year. Largely speaking, for Ireland, these have been about economic issues, but Paul will be telling you all about this later on. So this is just a diagram to explain or confuse, depending on your point of view. But basically, it shows you in terms of the calendar when these different things happen and the two different streams within which they happen. So you can see that there's an annual cycle going round and round and round where we have a measurement of what's going on in Europe and at the national level, and then you have the reporting on what we're doing, and then you have direction on what you need to do to do it better. So that's it. Thank you very much. I hope that was okay.
Thank you very much, Michael. We can take some questions on that later. For now, I'm going to introduce. I'm going to introduce Marion Harkin, independent MEP, and Marion, I think this is your third term. And Marion has got a community development background, and is also on a member of the Parliament's Employment and Social Affairs Committee. And I think you've had a lot of engagement with the Better Europe Alliance this week, because Marion co-hosted a hearing in Parliament this week where the Better Europe Alliance, which is the other 3 pilot countries, all presented on how they're finding the whole process. So I'm just going to introduce Marion, who's going to speak very briefly, I hear. And then, because she has to leave, she's going to take questions from the floor just then. Okay? So very, very warm welcome for Marion. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. As explained, I have to leave. I have to be in Castlebar at 1 o'clock, but if I'm there at 1:45, that should do. And when all of that is done, I have to make my way back up to Maynooth later this evening. So it's a busy schedule, so apologies for the fact that I have to run. But I don't want anybody to think that it's the usual politician thing that I'm running in, giving my speech and running out again, because as you said, I co-hosted the event in the Parliament this week, myself and Jean Lambert, and I also met some people from Age and Opportunity last Friday in Galway. I don't know if any of you are here today. You said you would be. I spent 2 hours last Friday listening to their concerns and their issues, and also I met the Disability Federation and others. I co-hosted another event this week in the Parliament, again, where this issue was, if you like, on the agenda. And I know I'm meeting Michael next Friday to talk about your specific area, the environmental pillar issues. So I am listening to people. I'm trying to find ways and mechanisms that, you know, your voices can be heard in all of this process. So the fact that I have to leave here today, as I said, doesn't mean that I don't know about this and I'm not interested in it. I most certainly am. As you've been told, I'm on the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, and I'm also on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. So obviously the whole Europe 2020 and the European semester is central to a lot of what we're doing. And you've already heard the 5 headline targets. Just to refresh your minds again, employment rate at 75%, reduce greenhouse gases by 20% below the 1990 levels, increase energy efficiency by 20%, renewables 20%, at 3% of our GDP should be spent on research and development, and that's one that we're failing at miserably, as well as the employment rate. The 40% of the population in tertiary education, and by 2020, and also reduction in the number of early school leavers. That actually is one of the targets Europe-wide. We're on target with that one. And of course, most of you will know why, because the jobs aren't there, so people are staying in education longer, etc. There may be other reasons as well, but that's one of the targets that we do hope to achieve. And one of the targets that we're way off being is we had hoped to live 20 more million people out of poverty. In fact, as you know, it's going in the opposite direction. And I think for me, one of the scary things is not just that figure, but that the divergences between member states, as far as risk of poverty is concerned, are increasing. and the divergences within member states. And that to me is probably the red light that's flashing most brightly in all of this. But I'm only going to speak for 10 minutes. I was initially scheduled to speak for 20 minutes. I'm going to speak for 10 minutes or less, so that, you know, we have a few minutes for questions rather than just my saying my bit and running out of here. So I'm going to be very brief in what I'm saying. And what I think might be useful is the week before last in Strasbourg, the European Parliament itself voted on a resolution on Europe 2020. Now, a resolution is the opinion of the Parliament on where we are and what progress has been made and what progress we think needs to be made and what direction we should go in. And what I think might be useful, just for the 3 or 4 minutes I have left, is to give you some highlights from that, or just some of the points that were voted through overwhelmingly by the Parliament in Strasbourg. So at least you see, you know, what the thinking of the European Parliament is. I'm just going to pick a few at random here. I may not cover all the issues because I don't have the time, but maybe we could come to those in the questions. But, I mean, they talk about the situation and the figures and you know, how bad they are, and, you know, referencing issues about people with disabilities, etc., and about how the social fund needs to be much more aligned with the Europe 2020 targets, etc. But to come to some of the more hard-hitting comments that have been made, the very first paragraph that is here.
Sorry, you're just hitting buttons there. That's
Okay. The very first paragraph that's here says, expresses regret that current policies remain focused solely on economic growth without acknowledging the need for inclusive, rights-based and sustainable approach, stresses that the benefits of growth need to be spread throughout society for it to become sustainable. And that was one of the comments that was very strong at the meeting earlier this week, the fact that the economic seems to overshadow everything else, and that everything else is sort of well down the line, as it were. So you can see there that the Parliament itself agrees. It's paragraph number 1. Also, we're talking about the fact that we need to look at how we measure things. In fact, I was involved myself in a report in the Parliament in the last term, GDP and beyond. In other words, looking at how we measure things and incorporating that into EU 2020. Another paragraph here, I'm just picking at random, recalls the importance of the social partners when it comes to labour market policies, and stresses that consultation with them should be an integral part of the process. Calls therefore on the Council, the Commission and the Member States to increase the involvement of the social partners in order to ensure the successful implementation of the Europe 2020 strategy. Another paragraph, that was number 8, number 10, urges the Commission and Member States to ensure that any increase in the employment rate is the result of adding to the number of quality jobs within the European economy. And the next paragraph also refers to that point, and it says, regrets the fact that the increase in employment rates have partly been the result of precarious forms of employment, such as zero-hour contracts, bogus self-employment and involuntary part-time work. Is concerned that such jobs do not provide workers with a decent living and adequate labour rights. And in fact, in Strasbourg 2 or 3 weeks ago as well, we had a visit from the Pope, and that was one of his central messages. He talked about the dignity of work, but he really emphasised the point that if the work that people have keeps them in poverty, if it doesn't give them a decent living for themselves and their families, then it doesn't basically deserve the name of work. And I don't know if any of you listened to what the Pope had to say. Most of us did, because we were sitting there. And I'll tell you, he did not pull his punches. He did not set out to seduce the members of the Parliament, I can assure you. And yet, for whatever reason, when he was finished, thank you, he got, in my experience, the longest and the most sustained round of applause from all sides of the House, because some things he said suited the left of the House and other things he said suited the right of the House, so it was interesting to see it. But he certainly delivered some very strong messages to us. The other point, and I've been told I have 2 minutes left, and I think for me, this is, I spoke about the red light a minute ago, but this to me is one of the most important points, and it's this. It says, calls for rebalancing within the strategy of financial and economic priorities with strong social priorities in order to ensure that social policies are enabled. Stresses that employment and social considerations should be put on a par with macroeconomic ones in the procedure of the European semester. Calls furthermore for the organisation of joint meetings between EPSCO and ECOFIN councils, and what that means is the social affairs ministers, that's EPSCO, and ECOFIN is the finance ministers, so the joint meetings of those in order to achieve a coherent position, because what you find is ECOFIN or the finance ministers, they basically call the shots, and then EPSCO sort of tries to slot in. So there's no point in us saying this if we don't talk about a way that that can be achieved. I was told I had 2 minutes 2 minutes ago, so it's time for me to finish up. But to me, that is perhaps, and that has taken a long time in the Parliament, at least the last 3 years of the last Parliament, particularly from the committee that I'm on, there was a very, very strong push to try to get social indicators and macroeconomic indicators on the same level, and furthermore to add to the list of social indicators. In fact, in this resolution, it asks, for example, that the child poverty, homelessness, and there is a third one, I can't just think of it at the moment, that they would be added to the list of social indicators, but that they would be on a par. This is the first time the entire Parliament, it's the Employment and Social Affairs Committee is just one committee. We have voted for this many times, but we never got it through the Parliament before, but now we have. And I hope that indicates a shift in thinking. And my final comment is that our new Commissioner for Employment and Social Affairs, Marianne Thyssen, we've had a number of meetings with her, meetings within the committee, and my very first question, when we were questioning the commissioners before we voted for them, to Marianne Thyssen was about social and economic indicators. And even then, when she had to be very careful about what she was saying, she did talk about rebalancing. But very strongly this week, we had 3 commissioners. We had Dombrovskis, who's one of the 5, if you like, vice presidents. We had Moscovici, who's the French commissioner, and we had Marianne Thyssen. So that was social and economic commissioners all together at a joint meeting of employment and the economic committee. And she said quite clearly, and they agreed, that we need more social indicators and they need to be at the same level. So I think, while I wouldn't describe it as a complete shifting of the ground, I see a shift in thinking, and all I can hope for is that that will help to deliver positive outcomes. And my final message is, before I sit down, I said it at the meeting in Brussels, and I'm saying it again, I am, and I mean this genuinely, I'm very grateful that organisations like yours come together, because I represent over 1 million people, various different interests, etc. And in order for me to genuinely feel that I can express the views of those I represent, organisations like yours are a godsend, because you represent so many different strata and different sectors and interests, that I know that if I can work with you and other organisations that I work with, that I then have a reasonable opportunity of representing a diverse set of views and inputting, into European policy in a meaningful way. So I want to thank you for that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I think that's a very, very expansive 10 minutes worth, and a lot of information there. So bearing in mind the time, we're going to move straight to some questions from the floor. So if any of you would like to got a question for Marianne about the breadth and depth of what she's been explaining to us, we'll take your views. I don't know, have we got a roaming mic? Yeah. Okay, we have a roaming mic. And just to let you know, while we're getting organised with that, thank you, Piers, that the hashtag for the conference today is hashtag BetterEU. So if you're tweeting, hashtag BetterEU. Thank you. So do we have any questions? Yes. And if you'd like to say your name, and if you do represent an organisation, to say what your organisation is. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Siobhan Curran from Pavey Point. Thank you for your talk. I just was interested when you talked about the divergence between countries and within countries, and particularly in some of the targets when you look at, for example, employment, education and poverty. Travellers and Roma would be disproportionately impacted. So I suppose kind of to make that point, but also to ask the question, in terms of measurement towards the targets, is there an attempt to gather disaggregated data and to ensure that these groups that will be disproportionately impacted are gathered in reaching the targets?
Okay, thank you very much, Siobhan. Do we have any other questions? Please raise your hands because we can't see everybody from here. There's a question at the very back here.
Thank you very much. Philip Carney, the Antarctica Climate Change Committee. Thank you very much, Marion, for what you said. I'd like to add an extra dimension, that the well-being of those in poverty and those with disabilities is also threatened very much by climate impacts. That is the most serious overarching threat that we face. I will come back to this later in the day. It got a mention thus far, but it didn't get this kind of emphasis and primacy that I think it needs, and I will come back to this later on. I wanted to flag it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. Do we have one more question, perhaps, before I give the mic back to Marion? Okay. So, Marion, we've 2 points here. One about the disaggregation of data from Siobhan and Pavey Point to reveal more statistics about people who are more marginalised. And then if you've got a comment on Philip's point about the extra dimensions attached to climate change.
Yes, Siobhan, just specifically looking at what's in this resolution, one of a number of paragraphs actually talk about disaggregating data. I look here at paragraph 42 and it talks for a sub-target. Now it's for reducing child poverty to be set into the Europe 2020 mid-term review. Another one talks about gender. Where it says, calls on the Commission and Member States to incorporate a gender pillar in the Europe 2020 framework so as to measure progress on reducing the gender employment gap, etc. And there is also another one on 18 talking about, it's not quite the same, but it's similar. It's asking through ex-ante coordination of future economic reforms, social impact assessment and associated solidarity mechanisms. That would be things like social security, etc. Calls for such coordination to be supported by a comprehensive ex-ante and ex-post social and gender impact assessment. But there isn't anything specific there. But I do know that somewhere else in this resolution we do talk about subpopulations. I can't just spot it at the moment, but I know it's there. And I know exactly what you mean, because we can have overall poverty figures and they don't reflect specific groups. And you mention travellers and Roma. People with disabilities would be another group that would have much higher poverty levels because of difficulty in access to employment, and equally because in some countries at least, social supports have been cut significantly. And I suppose it's just an aside altogether, but just talking about persons with disability, and I mentioned this at the meeting yesterday, the first thing I thought of when I heard David Cameron's proposals about, no benefits unless you're working, is that if that were to be, taken on board, it would mean immediately that people with a disability, their right to any kind of free movement across the EU would be gone overnight. But that's just another point. But yes, I hear what you're saying, but there definitely is here about subpopulations. I just can't spot it. Philip, Indeed, one of the, I know one of my colleagues in the Parliament is Jean Lambert, who happens to be a Green from London. Jean and myself work on a lot of social issues together, and she was a bit concerned that there wasn't enough in this resolution about climate change. I suppose the only one that I can spot straight away, it says, calls for a strong ambition to achieve the climate change and energy sustainability targets, as these are integral to smart, sustainable and inclusive growth, which I think is the point you were making, that if we don't deal with the issue of climate change, that again some of the sectors that we talk about that are already at the highest risk of poverty, that they will be hit hardest again. I suppose the other comment I'll make before I go, because it was very much in the news last week about Jean-Claude Juncker and his 315 billion investment package. Now, regardless of your view of it, I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to make it work. And again, the Parliament, I know, will try its best to influence that package in a way that it's not just, you spend money on a project because the project is there and it sounds good, that you've got to look at outcomes as well. Sometimes people think there's a lot of European money out there, and in many, presentations that I give, etc., one of the things I always point out is that for every euro that's spent across the EU, member states spend 99 cents of it. The EU itself spends 1 cent. So that gives you an indication of the kind of resources that the European Union has. So therefore, whatever money we have has to be spent very strategically. And as some of you here will know, of all of that money, just over a third of it goes to agriculture, and about a third of it, or a little bit more, goes to cohesion, and social would be part of that. But just to finish off with Juncker, there was last week a motion of censure on Juncker, which was defeated in the Parliament because of LuxLeaks. Now, that issue was political. It was put forward by Marine Le Pen and by UKIP, and even the very, what we might call the hard left of the House, which would like to see Juncker censured, didn't actually vote for it. They just abstained, I think, because they just couldn't associate themselves with that particular proposal. But I think one of the big issues we're going to face in the Parliament over the next couple of years, and Europe is going to face, and I think if we handle it right, it can make a difference, is the whole area of corporate tax. And because Juncker was president of Luxembourg, in a way it puts more onus on him to do something real, to do something meaningful, and to change what is happening. Because no one country can do this on their own. Indeed, Europe probably can't do it on its own. It needs to be a global response. But just like Europe is leading on climate change, whether it's achieving what it should or not is an entirely different question, but it's certainly leading on it. I think it can lead on this, and there's an appetite within the Parliament for this. There was not an appetite to censure Juncker because he's a commissioner. If we censure him, at the very beginning of the term, then the whole thing falls into chaos, and we can't have that either. But I think there will be a significant amount of pressure to ensure that corporations, begin to pay their fair share of tax. And I think if we can get something like that moving over the next few years, really moving, as distinct from just tinkering at the edges, that could be a very significant improvement in the way we run our affairs. But look, I'm going to leave it at that because I think that's the end of the questions and my time is just up, so I'm not taking anybody else's. And again, apologies for the fact that I need to run. This is genuine, I just need to be somewhere else. But I am in I won't say constant contact, but in regular contact with many of the people here. There's a number of the faces that are familiar, and any of you, any organisation that wants to meet me, I try to manage it. I have some meetings in Dublin next week, and as you're one of them, Michael, and I know I'm meeting Impact, the trade union, and I know I have one or two others who are looking for meetings, but I'd be more than happy to try and facilitate that. And I look forward genuinely to hearing the deliberations from today and to working with your organisation to see, how can we influence for the better what's happening. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marion. And thank you for all the energy that you've put into this and the vast amount of information that we have already that will tap into some of the conversations we'll be having throughout the course of the morning. So thank you very much, and I wish you a safe journey to the West and back, as it seems. Okay. So I would like now to introduce Paul Ginnell, who's known to very many of you. Paul is the policy officer with the European Anti-Poverty Network, and a very capable person in terms of really coordinating the Better Europe Alliance. And also, this morning he's going to talk to us briefly about the priorities for the future of the European semester. And it will really, I think, build on a lot of, and make maybe clearer as well, a lot of what Marion has raised with us and what Michael has raised with us already. Okay, so I'll hand over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joan. I'm on the clock, so I'll try and go as fast as I can and get through the presentation. Pretty much what I have to say is in the last chapter of the book you have here, the last article, which summarises, I suppose, the key issues and priorities for the Better Europe Alliance. So what I'm presenting is, I suppose, what we've worked on as an alliance over the last number of months, our assessment of different issues, our analysis of different areas and priorities, and our proposals in terms of change for the future in order to make the European semester and Europe 2020 as was more effective in terms of addressing the social and sustainable issues it needs to address. Just in terms of how I'm going to approach it, the issue of balance, which Marion has mentioned as well, going to cover that to some extent. The issue of equality and gender as cross-cutting issues, coming back from what was mentioned earlier in terms of the input from Siobhan and Pavy Point. Looking at economic policy, and then going through a number of the different targets that are in Europe 2020, the employment, climate change, education, poverty and social exclusion targets, some key points in relation to those, and then finishing with the issue of improving debate and participation, which in itself is one of the key issues and elements in relation to the success or otherwise of Europe 2020 and the semester. In relation to a balanced approach, from our own analysis, that the Europe 2020 strategy or the semester as a whole, as is mentioned, is for smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. So in a sense, the economic, environmental and social issues are supposed to be addressed in equal way and of equal importance. But from our analysis, that's not been the way it's been, and the European Parliament takes the same view, and a lot of others as well, that the economic has dominated, and negative economics, because economic in itself is not bad, but it's the type of growth and the type of economics we've had, and the focus has been damaging, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But that's damaging to all three areas. It's even damaging in terms of the economy as well, not just to the social and environmental elements. And that imbalance is reflected in the 2014 country-specific recommendations for Ireland. If everybody understood Michael's clear presentation of how the semester works, the European Commission, and it's endorsed by all the heads of state, issues recommendations for every country in the EU once a year. And this year was the first time we got a large number, because we were in Troika programme before that. So this year we got 7 recommendations. 2 of them are actually quite good. They look like that. 2 of them are actually quite good from our point of view, addressing unemployment and the services and supports that need to be there to tackle that. And also looking at issues for groups in society that have low work intensity or have low uptake in terms of work. And there's a proposal in relation to improving access to affordable childcare, which is key. But the first one is around macroeconomic targets and the importance of keeping to our deficit and debt targets, reducing our deficit and making sure we reduce our debt levels. So to a great extent, how it proposes we do that undermines how we might invest, for example, in affordable, accessible childcare in this country. So it's how there's contradictions within the recommendations and the need for them to be put in a balanced way, as opposed to one dominating or even undermining the others. So that's what in relation to our proposals then, is that there needs to be a balanced approach to the overall objectives of Europe 2020 and the semester. And that needs to also be reflected in the recommendations made to member states. And also there needs to be a recognition of the interdependence of different elements of the strategy. One of the contributors early on from the floor mentioned the importance of climate change and how that can impact on issues around poverty and social exclusion. So the semester and the Europe 2020 is not separate targets for different areas that don't impact on each other. It's supposed to be an integrated approach, and we want to see that. And the Alliance in its makeup tries to reflect that. And another area I've highlighted is the issue of employment, which was mentioned also by Marion. If we have bad quality jobs, it's going to result in more in-work poverty. It undermines the poverty target. So all the targets are independent and must work together. Looking at equality and gender as cross-cutting issues, I was mentioned earlier, and it was well prepped earlier in terms of the input from Siobhan, that some groups experience worse outcomes in different areas, for example, in terms of education, employment, and poverty and social exclusion than others. And I've listed a number of the groups here. So it's important then that that's reflected in how the strategy is implemented. So I won't go through all the groups in terms of time, but you can see it covers a broad range, and different groups in different areas experience higher levels of unemployment or poverty, lower levels in terms of education outcomes, or worse outcomes in terms of education than others. So that needs to be reflected. So in terms of our proposals in that area, we're asking that there need to be sub-targets, for example, in relation to poverty and social exclusion, for groups that experience higher levels. Because that's a key, in a sense, to making sure that no group is left behind. People with disabilities were mentioned earlier, for example, in relation to unemployment, that people with disabilities have lower outcomes, lower participation in the workforce than the broader population. There needs to be sub-targets to reflect that. Because in a sense, the targets, while they're political in many ways and things need to be done in different ways with those, they actually do drive policy. Targets are what somehow politically gets the attention, gets the focus. So it's important then that we have sub-targets in relation to different groups in order to make sure that no groups are left behind, as we've mentioned. And also gender mainstreaming, issues in relation to gender, that needs to be mainstreamed across the whole of the semester process. I was mentioned earlier in relation to if you have a sub-target, specific sub-targets or targets in relation to employment for women alongside men, as opposed to them collectively as a group, men and women collectively, as is in the current target, then you have to address issues as in the gender pay gap, issues around the barriers to prevent women from accessing employment in the same way, same level as men, and so on. So you have to address things in a particular way and give focus to particular policies. So coming back then to the economic policy, which I mentioned earlier in terms of the balance or the imbalance in the strategy as we've seen it so far. That currently the macroeconomic or economic policy, as we're well aware, not just in Ireland but across the EU, has been dominated by an austerity approach that looks to reduce currently budget deficits. And potentially, if we don't have growth in our economy, as they're saying, our debt levels will remain high. And so we'll have to start cutting budgets again, in a sense, to reduce our debt levels. So we're not at the end of the road yet in many ways. And if people are aware that the Troika left a year ago, almost exactly, but they came back to visit a few weeks ago on an annual return to make sure that we're implementing what they asked in the programme, or we're keeping up the speed. And they highlighted the fact that we need to keep reducing our deficit and keep within our targets to reduce the deficit and watch out for our debt. So they're very much keeping an eye on this. This is very much a priority in certain sections at EU level. So it is still driving decisions. Also, the way things have been done are not informed by social and environmental concerns, really. So a lot of what was done in terms of reducing the deficit didn't take the social and environmental impact into account. So what we're proposing is that there needs to be impact assessment across a broad range of areas, as was mentioned earlier again in the European Parliament resolution. So in terms of environmental, poverty, equality and gender impact assessment needs to be carried out before decisions are being made, to inform those decisions, to look at how they will affect those areas. Also, in terms of our priorities at economic level, we are supportive of the proposals to widen the tax base and to increase tax levels towards the EU average. That's necessary in order to fund quality and accessible public services, an adequate social protection system. Also, in relation to how it's done, it must strengthen the fairness and progressivity of the taxation system. So there are key principles of how it's done. It must reduce inequalities and also avoid environmental harm. So there are key principles in how we broaden the tax base to do what we need to do. But we also recognise as an alliance that for those on the lowest incomes, there have been quite a lot of taxation changes which have had a big impact on those and have increased the cost of living for people and reduced their take-home pay where they're working. So we recognise that, so that needs to be taken into account also in relation to changes on taxation. In the area of employment, so now I'm looking at some of the targets within the Europe 2020 strategy. That our analysis that providing quality jobs and reducing unemployment is critical to support Ireland's exit from the crisis. However, as has been highlighted again earlier, so I was well prepped, the increase in low quality precarious jobs undermines this recovery and increases poverty. And I've just given a few statistics there. More than 1 in 8 of those at risk of poverty are in work, and 1 in 5 of those experience deprivation is in work. So we cannot just jobs at any cost, it must be quality jobs. Another area is that the public employment service, the way it's structured currently in terms of Intrio and so on, that it focuses on those on the live register, and of course they need support and that's important, but it excludes other groups of working age who are not on the live register, people who might need their supports also. So our proposals are that in order to support people of working age to move from welfare to work, it must be done in a sustainable, effective and equitable way. And that needs a balanced approach. So at a EU level, there's an active inclusion strategy which was agreed a good number of years ago. And it says in terms of supporting people, addressing those people most distant from the labour market, that we need to do a balanced approach which looks at ensuring adequate income, whether they're in or out of work. It must provide access to quality services and also an inclusive labour market for all groups with decent jobs. So that's the approach that needs to be taken in order to support people. And that balanced approach needs to be applied in terms of the Pathways to Work strategy, which is currently in place. So in terms of how Intrio works, Job Path, which is coming on stream to work with those private companies, it'll be working with those who are long-term unemployed, and also the Youth Guarantee needs to apply that balanced approach. And it must move away from an increasingly directive approach, which has more conditionality and also sanctions, to a system that focuses on resourcing and enabling people to make informed choices. So that's how the service needs to be developed. And then also, in terms of the exclusionary approach that currently exists, that Intrio and Job Path services need to be revised and extended to all people of working age who may voluntarily wish to access the supports and services in order to return to work. So I've named a couple of people on different payments. If people on disability allowance, for example, wish to approach Intrio office, they're not a priority because they're focusing on those on the live register. So there are certain groups, if you're not on the live register, are not a priority for Intrio or for our current public employment service. So if people approach them voluntarily, who want to get their supports in terms of returning to work, they should be able to get the supports on an equal basis. Also, we link to that very much is addressing the poverty cycle, whereby adults in low work intensity households, so say in households headed by a person with a disability or a lone parent, other households like that, they're caught in a cycle whereby on social welfare supports and the access, their only available work or options that might be available for them are often low paid, maybe precarious work, and eventually they end up back on social welfare supports again. And that becomes a cycle which needs to be broken. The issue of quality work must be explicitly addressed in the National Reform Programme and country-specific recommendations. And also in relation to affordable, accessible childcare, that needs to be implemented. That's already a country-specific recommendation. That needs to be implemented in a smart, sustainable and inclusive way, involving investment in childcare provision, and not just in supporting access to employment, but participation in society more broadly. In relation to climate change, we believe that the targets agreed at EU and national level to address climate change are not ambitious enough to address the crisis as currently exists in relation to climate change. And also, as I mentioned earlier, climate change has a value across and importance across other areas as well, employment and social inclusion, the issue of fuel poverty and public health. So climate change is not something that's happening over there. It has implications across all sectors of society and how we live in our own environment and our own society. So the proposal from the Alliance is to raise the EU target for greenhouse gas reductions for 2020 to 30% and adopt a target of 55% reduction for 2030, which is more ambitious, much more ambitious than that currently adopted at EU level and national level. Also, currently the EU is negotiating with the US a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. That agreement, if it goes through, if it continues, should not result in a lowering of standards at EU level, including commitments around climate change. We might not consider them to be ambitious enough, but they should not be reduced as part of an international agreement in order to improve trade across different continents. In relation to our analysis in terms of education, across to a broader range of issues in education, but just I'm focusing on the issue of literacy. There are a couple of statistics there that 1 in 6 adults find reading and understanding everyday text difficult. 1 in 4 people has difficulty in the maths, in relation to maths. And also currently there's very limited investment in those with low literacy levels and a high risk that people with low literacy levels will be left behind, while focusing in terms of access to the labour market on those that are closer or that need less supports in terms of investment. So just to say that currently people with very low levels of literacy, 1 to 3, for example, junior cert or lower, can only avail of 2 to 6 hours literacy support a week, which is very insufficient in terms of their needs. So what we're proposing is a new adult literacy target to be introduced as part of the education targets in Europe 2020. Okay, I've just been given a minute ago my 2-minute warning, so I'll try not to be too long. It was highlighted earlier as well that one of the key areas, one of the real dangers in relation to the strategy so far, and areas where we're not achieving and going backwards in relation to poverty and social exclusion. I have a graph up there, I can't go into the details of it, but that's in relation to increase in poverty levels, and you'll see that all lines are going upwards. And that is enough, I suppose, in some ways, just to highlight the real difficulty and the real impact of austerity measures and cuts and so on, in relation to the crisis overall, but also in relation to decisions that have been made. The national target is there to reduce consistent poverty to 4% by 2016 and 2% or less by 2020. But in 2012, already that had increased, and now 352,000, or more than nearly 353,000 people are in consistent poverty. There are people who are both at risk of poverty and experience material deprivation, so they're on very low incomes and can't afford the basic necessities. So, as I was saying, that's caused both by the crisis, in terms of unemployment and so on, but also compounded by austerity policies and decisions that were made in reacting to the crisis. It's made a situation of those who were already on the margins of society even worse, because we're not saying things were perfect beforehand. There were people still in poverty and social exclusion before the crisis. Their situation has been compounded and made worse. And also the poverty and social exclusion is caused by a range of different factors, and some groups in society experience higher levels of poverty and social exclusion than the general population. So what we're calling for is an integrated EU-wide strategy on poverty and social exclusion. Currently, the way the EU approaches it in small documents which highlight different elements. We want a more concrete strategy at an EU level, a clear approach. I'm out of time. In terms of how it's currently been addressed, that addresses the causes and consequences of poverty in a broad way. Currently, if you really look at how their current strategies for addressing poverty and social exclusion, it focuses on access to labour market, access to employment for people who are distant from the labour market and so on as being the solution. It's an important solution, of course, but there are a lot of people who will not and cannot access employment. currently or even in the longer term, they also need to be properly protected and protected from poverty and social exclusion. And it's also a very complex issue which need to be addressed in that way. So, for example, looking at the issue of inequality. Just in terms of one of the areas we've highlighted is in relation to housing. I think it's currently getting a lot of coverage, but it is an immediate crisis which needs short-term solutions to address those who are currently experiencing homelessness, but also long-term solutions in relation to social housing. And finally, in my minus time, this is a really key one, but so not to leave it last and least in many ways, that when the Alliance came together, it came to do two things. One was, of course, to change policies, to improve on the policies and the implementation and the balance. The other one was to improve the level of debate and engagement around the strategy and around the semester. Currently, the level of debate is very little. If you ask anybody really around some of this, they will not have heard about the Europe 2020 strategy for sure. They may have heard that we have to reduce our budget deficit, and that comes up quite a lot, but they don't know, in a sense, where that's linked to or where it comes from. It very much comes from how the semester is driven. So for ourselves as an alliance, we want to ensure our push for an increase in the level of debate within Parliament, also broadly within civil society, so that people understand that there are certain priorities, there are budgetary or other priorities which are being laid down at a European level, and they're impacting on us all, and they're impacting on decisions that have been made. But there is a broader strategy which is supposed to be balanced, and we need it to be implemented in that way which was intended initially, and to involve broader civil society in that. Currently, a lot of local organisations, very grassroots organisations, are experiencing a lot of cuts, or even there will be had to close. Those organisations need to be resourced to be able to engage from the bottom up, from grassroots to the top level. So, just as I said, that's a really key part of what we're trying to push. So I said, last but not least, it's a key priority for us. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Paul. I think the degree to which Paul's run over gives a really good indication of how much work needs to be done here and how engaged we are as part of the Better Europe Alliance in making sure that that happens. So thank you, Paul.